Thank you so much, Lindsay. I'll just mention on the side here for folks with Artera, the microphone is blinking red down there. So if our battery goes out, get me a new battery and we should be good. So I think we're going to be okay for now. Thank you so much. I love coming up here to Lawrence. This is a beautiful venue. Wow, look at the turnout that we have. I'm very, very honored and pleased, and really excited to be presenting this year's Lawrence Housing Forecast. First of all, those of you who don't know, I realize that those squiggles on the side there, it looks a little bit like a QR code. That's not. If it takes you someplace when you point your phone at it, don't blame me for wherever it takes you. I'm still a little bit old school, and so the slides for my presentation today, here's the point, are available on the Center for Real Estate's website at realestate.wichita.edu, or you could go to wichita.edu/realestate. Either one will take you right there. And the slides are posted right on the home page. You'll see a link to the Lawrence Board of Realtors presentation today. So if you want to look at those, but also feel free to take pictures, feel free to post, tag us if you do, all of that's great. The publications that you have there on the table and are also on the tables over there, which Rob would be very grateful if you would take them back to your offices. We print those and we put them together for you to be able to use with your clients and your customers. I know that a lot of realtors use them in listing presentations. They will use them with relocation packets, other times that you're dealing with clients to really help understand this is not just me saying what's going on, this is what is really happening in the market. I've even received some back, I'm on a lot of mailing lists from real estate agents, and I've actually received copies of the forecast from real estate agents that send it to me. So that's always exciting. But use them, take advantage of them. We are able to produce these because of the very generous support of a lot of sponsors around the state. And the Lawrence Housing Forecast is sponsored by Security First Title and Meritrust Credit Union. They've been supporting us for a number of years, and we're very grateful for that. Thank you so much. And so, when you see the folks from Meritrust or Security First around here, make sure you thank them for that, because it's especially, for as challenging as it's been with the rest of us with the drop in sales activity, as realtors, we forget that part of lenders' payments and the income that they earn and title companies is also refinancing activity. And if sales transactions have dropped off, refinancings have cratered. And so the fact that they've continued to support us and do that despite the downturn in their business activity just shows how important they think this is and how much they want to support all of you in being able to provide this information. So again, we're really, really grateful for that. And we're also grateful, I think it's been almost, and that I think is when the microphone went. So if you've got the new battery with that, I think most of you can hear me for now, but it's nice to have that microphone there. Can you all hear me okay in the back? For at least a moment or two. We've had a partnership with the Kansas Association of Realtors for, I think, almost 15 years now, where we access your MLS data and be able to provide the monthly statistical reports. That is paid for through the Kansas Association. Your dues to the Kansas Association help make that data available for your local board. And the local boards receive all those reports at no charge. The partnership is beneficial for us as well because it allows us, thank you, because it allows us to be able to access the data to be able to do these reports. So again, we're very grateful for that partnership. And so with that, I want to take a little bit more time today and talk about the underlying economic environment and where we've been. It's been a lot of turmoil, a lot of questions. And for those who don't know, my background is actually as an economist. I earned my PhD at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and then I spent my first job out of graduate school was with the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland as a financial economist. And so this background is sort of part and parcel to me and goes into what I do with the housing forecast. So last year when we talked, I said, the question that I think I had for this slide was the question of, will we have a recession? And now the question is, will we have a soft landing? And I told you at the time that a year ago, my belief was that we would not have a recession. We had not entered a recession, and that we would not have a deep recession. If we had a recession, it would not be a deep recession. And I am even more optimistic today about that than I was a year ago. This slide that I have here is real gross domestic product growth, and it's a measure of the total goods and services that are produced in the economy. The key area on this is the zero line. It's kind of right in the middle there, the zero line. If this is above the zero line, it means we produced more goods and services this quarter than we did the prior quarter. And generally, sometimes we might say, 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth would be the definition of a recession. That's not exactly correct. Actually, I think we had 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth early in 2022. It was so mild and the labor markets were so strong that they ended up saying, no, that was not a recession, okay? But we really seem to have steadied down, and if you look here, you'll notice that economic output now nationwide, and US as a whole is the dark blue line on this, our economic output is roughly at the same pace that we were prior to the pandemic, okay? And so I think we are settling into a very good, solid, slow, steady, normal economic growth rate after getting through all of the whipsawing that we had from the pandemic. Unemployment rates remain incredibly low, so people who want jobs have been able to find them for the most part, and employment growth remains fairly strong nationwide. One thing I do want to point out here on this, again, the red line on this is the United States, the blue line is the Lawrence metropolitan area. And it may look like, the US was catching up with Lawrence prior to the pandemic. That's the wrong way to look at that. These numbers are on 2 different axes. The US numbers, I think, are on the right-hand side, and the Lawrence numbers are on the left. What it really means is the US was growing really, really fast prior to the pandemic, and Lawrence was growing very, very slowly. Since then, the growth rates have been about the same as what we've had. Lawrence growth rate of employment and the US growth rate of employment, the slopes of those lines are very, very similar, okay? But again, this is just total number of jobs, and again, we're well above where we were prior to the onset of the pandemic. The Center for Economic Development and Business Research just yesterday released their annual employment forecast for Kansas. And while they don't forecast the Lawrence metropolitan area specifically, they did forecast pretty strong growth for Kansas. 1.9% is what they're estimating we will end up this year. That's very strong growth for Kansas. Next year, that will slow down to about 0.5%. Again, that's below maybe our normal average of growth, but it's still consistent with that idea of a soft landing rather than having a real recession, okay? So our labor market situation, if I had to summarize that labor market situation and what it implies for housing markets, people who want jobs have jobs. I think a lot of the uncertainty about whether or not we're going to go into a deep recession and will that cause people to lose jobs, I think that's moderated a great bit. And so from a standpoint of demand for housing, people wanting to be able to buy, feeling confident about being able to buy from their job side of things, that I think is still very strong and stable. Okay, so that's good news in terms of what we see going forward. The other side or economic fundamental that we look at with this is the fundamental of the financing market. What's happening with financing? And one of the reasons that economists a year ago were saying, we're going to have a recession, is they were looking at this thing called the yield curve. And the yield curve looks at the different maturity or how long the federal government borrows. So across the bottom here, you will see we have 3-month Treasury, 1-year Treasury security, 2-year, 5-year, and 10-year. And these are the interest rates that are charged for these different terms. Now, to put this in a context that we are more familiar with, think about a 30-year fixed rate mortgage versus a 15-year fixed rate mortgage. Which one typically has a higher interest rate? The 30-year fixed rate mortgage. Usually, the normal course of events is that the longer term that you're borrowing, the higher the interest rate. That would be an upward sloping yield curve here. Well, the green line at the bottom is what the federal government's interest rates were 1 year ago for these different terms. And you can see that once you got past the 2-year point, the yield curve was downward sloping. The 10-year Treasury had a lower interest rate than the 2-year Treasury. And that's, as we said, that's unusual. Sometimes economists will use that as a predictor of a future recession. I don't personally believe it predicts a recession. What it predicts is that the market, investors believe that short-term interest rates will come down in the future compared to long-term interest rates. And one reason that could happen is because we have a recession and the Fed then lowers interest rates. Well, the red line on here shows where that yield curve was 6 months ago. And you can see, oh, the Fed just kept bringing up short-term interest rates. And so that really inverted the yield curve. More recently, however, the blue line at the top is the most recent yield curve number that I got earlier this week. And you can see the 3-month Treasury is over 5.5%, and the 10-year Treasury is over 4.5%. The entire yield curve has shifted up. And so that's suggesting that my personal expectation is that this change in longer term interest rates is going to be a more permanent situation. That 10-year Treasury, which is part of what determines the mortgage rates that we pay, the 30-year mortgage rate is the relative value of this 10-year Treasury. This is more consistent with where the 10-year Treasury was prior to the financial crisis in 2008. Now, there are those who view this increase in Treasury rates as being temporary. In particular, if any of you follow me on LinkedIn, you may have seen I posted an article last weekend by Nobel Prize winning economist. Now my mind is blanking there. New York Times columnist. He posted, just absolutely brain fart. Sorry about that. He argues, and has argued for a long time, that we are in a position, partially because of demographics and population growth slowing, that long-term interest rates actually should be lower. But he directly acknowledges this is an area where economists have very different views on these things. Why is that so important? Well, let me actually jump ahead one slide here. The 30-year fixed mortgage rate is typically tied very closely to the 10-year Treasury. So the blue line on the top here is the 30-year fixed mortgage rate going all the way back to 1985. The red line below it is the 10-year Treasury rate. And you can see they move pretty much in tandem with one another. The green line at the bottom shows the difference between these two interest rates. And that's the risk premium for mortgages as opposed to having a very safe investment like a 10-year Treasury, okay? The typical average risk premium for these mortgages has been about 1.6 or 1.7%, all the way back, going back to 1985. And you can see times when it's gone up higher have been relatively infrequent, and they've been relatively short, okay? And so, but you can notice here that in the recent years, that green line has gone up. It's almost a 3% premium, a full 100 basis points or more higher than where it typically is. That's causing mortgage rates to be higher than they would otherwise given the 10-year Treasury. Now, where I think about this, and we're really thinking about what will mortgage rates do going forward, okay? I personally believe that the 10-year Treasury, again, if you look at that, go back to the early 2000s, the 10-year Treasury was in this 4 to 5% range in the early 2000s prior to the financial crisis. And it was never below where we've been since the financial crisis. Again, that's the red line. I think we're getting back to a more normal range of what the 10-year Treasury ought to be, okay? That means that we should never expect those really low 3% mortgage rates to come back again. Even if we just add back the normal risk premium of, say, 1.7%, if we have a 4% Treasury rate and we had 1.5% or 2% of that, we're now getting close to 6% as a mortgage rate that we have. Does that make sense? The other piece that we have was the previous slide, which is our inflation expectations. So the mortgage rate also has to incorporate an increase. Treasury rate does too. They both have to incorporate some additional premium based on whether or not investors believe the inflation rate is going to continue being high in the future. It's not past inflation that matters, it's those inflation expectations. And I showed this slide last year and I talked about what markets were expecting. And the green line at the bottom is the line that is most important. It's called the 5-year break-even rate. And it is a measure that looks at financial markets and the trades that investors are doing on US Treasury securities and backs out of that what they implicitly believe the inflation rate will be over the next 5 years. And on average, they're expecting inflation over the next 5 years to be about 2.1 or 2.2%. So markets seem to believe that the Fed is going to get the inflation rate back down to that target level of 2% that we have, okay? So I believe that we are going to see that expected inflation come back down, okay? And that's going to, we've seen I think the Treasury rates are back to basically normal. And I don't think we're going to see them go substantially higher unless we see higher inflation. But I think that the worst of the inflation is behind us and that inflation is going to continue to come down, maybe slowly over time, but we're going to be at a lower level of inflation going forward. And so that leaves me with the mortgage rates forecast. And when I went to press, I usually use the Mortgage Bankers Association's forecast, and I think they were forecasting that mortgage rates would drop to something like 4.8% by the end of next year, and I'm going, I just can't believe that. And so I went and I looked at the NAR forecast, and their forecast is that the 30-year fixed mortgage rate will go down to 6% by the end of next year. Now, don't get too worried about that slope and the timing of that. It's really that end of 2024 target that I'm looking at. That 6% mortgage rate, if we get down to that, which again, if the 10-year Treasury kind of stays where it is, the mortgage risk premium comes back down, and markets are right about inflation coming down, that's a realistic, reasonable target, and that's right in the sweet spot of what I think normal market interest rates ought to be if we're in a good, healthy economy with low inflation and nothing funky going on in financial markets. I'll just mention here that the purple line at the bottom is the Mortgage Bankers Association's forecast. They did since raise it since we went to press, but they're still not quite as high as National Association of Realtors. So let me pause here and see if anybody has any questions about any of that before I start jumping into the housing market stuff. Any questions, comments, criticisms? Well, oh, there we go. Yes, go ahead.
Is the fact that 2024 being an election year have any thought or bearing into that prediction?
So the question is whether or not the 2024 being an election year has any play into that being into the prediction of what will happen with those mortgage rates. And the answer to that is no. Number one, I know that realtors often feel like an election year impacts buyers, and I have a lot of respect for your intuition. We've never really been able to tease out an election year effect when you go and look at housing market activity and things like that in the data itself. That doesn't mean that it's not there. We've just not been able to tease it out among everything else that's going on. A lot of people think that the Federal Reserve somehow manipulates interest rates based on what what's going on with the White House or who's in charge or something like that. Having worked there and knowing very much the deep, deep culture there, and something that we are very, very fortunate for in the United States, is that the central bank, the Federal Reserve, is isolated from those political pressures, okay? The president cannot go and fire the chairman of the Board of Governors, right? Can't do that. Once they're appointed, they're there for the term that they have. You can choose not to reappoint them, but the terms also are intended to offset so that if one president appoints a chairman of the Board of Governors, if he's not president or she's not president at the next time that the term comes up, they overlap terms. So there's independence that is there. And the Federal Reserve really focuses and thinks about what is the right thing to do. They may be wrong in that assessment, but they're really focused on that, not what do we need to do for political purposes, okay? So with that, what's been happening with home sales activity? Lawrence area home sales, we've had a really steep drop. Sales activity actually now is down to back where you were kind of right after the recovery from the pandemic. It's been a big drop in demand. Interest rates have had a significant impact on that. Let me see here. I think I have my cheat sheet here to see. Year to date in August, down 14% compared to where we were a year ago. And that's the levels that we saw last in 2015 through this time of the year. But the real thing to keep in mind is that inventories are a significant component of that. Yes, higher mortgage rates have influenced buyers and it has softened demand. It's also possible that we stole some demand in 2020 and 2021 when the rates were so low and people were coming so strong. But the low inventories are a real issue here. And you're now down to a place where you've been averaging about 100 home sales a month, 100 active listings every single month. That's less than half, about a third of what you had prior to the onset of the pandemic. And even if that's come up just a little bit here over the last couple of months, it's still really, really, really low. We typically think, you all know this, I focus on this balance between demand and supply and look at months supply. We take the number of active listings and we divide it by the average pace of sales over the prior year. And just as a rule of thumb, we say that a balanced market is one where you have between a 4 and a 6 month supply. And of course, in the Lawrence market, you've been below that since 2014. And it's a little hard to see the shading that I have there, but you've been below that for a long time, and you're still below a 2 month supply, which is below where you were prior to the onset of the pandemic. And so again, supply issues are the real constraint in the market. As a result, we're still seeing things that we were seeing in 2021, just not with the same extreme measure, okay? One of the challenges that you have when you go through an extreme event like what happened to the housing market after the pandemic is that it distorts your perception of normal. Matter of fact, that's the reason for this theme that we have. It's kind of like a television that doesn't quite tune in properly, and you get all the pixelization and things on it. Prior to the onset of the pandemic, we had really driven down. When you were sitting, 2018, 2019, and you were selling homes, with a median days on market of 20 days, you all were telling me, wow, this is crazy. It's just absolutely nuts. Well, then, of course, during the pandemic, it dropped down much, much lower. And what is your median days on market now? I didn't give my cheat sheet number there. I don't have it, but it's somewhere in the range of, it's less than 10 days. It's somewhere about a week is your typical. That means half of all homes sell in 7 or 8 days or less. Okay, that's really, really, really fast. And we are continuing, even though it's eased off a little bit, we are continuing to see a very high fraction of homes that sell at original list price or above original list price. So what I did here is I just calculated for every single month how many homes sold below the original list price, how them sold at or above original list price. And this is the percentage of homes that sold at or above the original list price. And while we got up to a place where it was almost 70% of homes that were selling during the craziness after the pandemic, it's still just below 60% of all homes that are selling that. Ordinarily, we would expect that number to be somewhere around 40% as kind of a normal market situation. So it is still very, very much a seller's market for those homes that are available on the market. Not the crazy, insane seller's market that it was a couple of years ago, but as you talk with sellers, as you work with people, there's a lot of data and evidence that suggests here we are not in a situation where you should somehow panic about selling. As you talk with your buyers, they shouldn't expect concessions all through the world on things. So hopefully these will give you some pictures and some stories to talk with them to help them understand what's really happening in the market. Because I know you all know that. What is our forecast for home sales? Well, we're forecasting that Lawrence home sales will be down this year 12.7%. By the way, that's a little bit less than where we are year to date, but that is because I think the worst of it is over. If you think about it, when sales began to really drop off in 2022, it was in the fall when we started to have the interest rates really began to take place. And earlier, when you go back to the spring, we were still in the nutso post-pandemic world there. And so dropping off from those highs wasn't necessarily something totally unusual, totally unexpected. And so as a result, we think most of the rest of the year you're going to end up closer to being on par with where you were last year. Does that make sense? And that'll cause us to end up year to date, total year end, a decrease in sales that won't be as bad as it's been so far this year. Next year, our forecast is basically flat. And this is really getting back to the kind of forecast that we had back in 2018, 2019, and it's reflecting the lack of inventory, not the lack of demand. Okay? So that's our forecast for next year. This is the worst piece of anything that I'll show you. So, and I don't think this is actually that bad. What we're basically saying is the worst is over. Okay? So, when you have, even with demand softening, when you have really, really tight inventories, that puts a lot of pressure on home price appreciation. And you can see here, the blue line is Lawrence. Lawrence, through the second quarter of this year, was the strongest home price appreciation in the state. 10% year-over-year appreciation. It peaked out a year ago at over 17% year-over-year appreciation. So home prices have just absolutely gone through the roof. Just crazy, crazy home price appreciation. Here's the thing that people need to keep in mind when they look at pictures like this. Do you see the dark black zero line that goes across? Anytime your home price appreciation number is above that, it means that values are going up. The fact that the line is downward sloping just means that we aren't appreciating as fast as we were previously. So think about it like this. You take off and you're gaining altitude really, 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 really quickly. And then your pilot hits cruising altitude and now you're not going to gain altitude anymore. That's a good thing. It doesn't mean because you're gain in altitude has dropped does not mean that you're about to crash. Because home price appreciation has slowed does not mean that home prices are about to fall, okay? And there's a big difference between what we saw and what caused the rapid appreciation in 2021 and 2022 compared to what was going on back in 2005, okay? And so there is not a situation, I think it's just almost inconceivable to see home prices drop. The worst case scenario I could imagine is to flatline for a while, which, by the way, if you look at Lawrence, that's kind of what happened between 2007 and 2014. You didn't really have significant declines. You bounced above and below zero for a while, but basically were flat. But given the shortage of inventory, I think that's highly unlikely. Our forecast is that Lawrence area home prices will increase 5.4% this year, and then increase another 4.4% next year. Now, 4.4% appreciation, that's really strong for the Lawrence market historically. That's, if you have inflation that's down in the 2.5%, maybe 3% range, that's real appreciation in your home values. So these are strong appreciation numbers. Don't let what happened in 2021 and 2022 give you a weird perspective on what normal really is, okay? So, why do we have such an inventory shortage? Well, permitting activity has certainly never recovered from the financial crisis. This slide is Lawrence it's all of Douglas County. It's the Lawrence metropolitan area, single-family building permits as reported by the U.S. Bureau of the Census, the monthly numbers. And you can see that prior to, going back all the way to 1995, you were averaging about 40 new building permits a month in Douglas County forever, right? That's just what you did. Following the financial crisis, that dropped down between 10 and 20 new single-family building permits. And if we came up just a little bit briefly, those spikes in 2018, those are something that we still suspect are a statistical, maybe an error, but I've gone back to the Bureau of the Census and said, hey, the folks in Lawrence say this isn't correct. And they've gone back and they say, no, it's right. So I can only go with what the Bureau of the Census gives me, but whether or not that blip was correct, we're still sitting below 20 permits a year on average, okay? So it's hard when we have had such low building activity for such a long period of time. I had a friend who told me once, if somebody walks 3 miles into the woods, turning around is a good first step, but they can't expect to be out of the woods until they walk 3 miles back. And if we've had about 15 years where we haven't been building enough homes to keep up with demand, we shouldn't expect that we're going to get out of this supply and inventory problem quickly, okay? So it's going to be something where we have to make good, positive plans about helping make permitting easier, opening up land to be able to be developed, doing things to help encourage new home development, and not just new homes, duplexes, apartments, across the board housing units. And we have to do it for a long period of time before we're really going to recover from all this. So what is my forecast? We're basically forecasting more of the same. 230 permits this year, that's down from last year, and the same for next year, 230 permits. We just don't see anything right now that's going to cause us to change that. I will just mention, new home construction across the state is the one area that mortgage rates hit worse than any other. And in particular, it's at the lower price points, although you can't really call low-end new homes low price points. But the more modest price points for new home construction, those buyers were heavily affected by the increase in construction costs and the increase in interest rates that just made it really, really hard for them to do that. And typically new home buyers have an existing home, so they just stayed. The permitting that's happening is typically at the very high-end custom homes, people for whom often the interest rates don't affect, either because they can afford the payment or they've got enough cash that they don't even need a loan, okay? Across the rest of the state, we are actually forecasting an increase in permitting activity next year. And that is based on this expectation that mortgage rates will decline next year. I think there's two impacts that we'll have that are going to help increase permitting activity at least a little bit in Kansas City, in Topeka, in Wichita, in other parts of the state. First of all, I do think there's an acclimation effect. People are going to get used to the fact that we're in a new era of mortgage rates, and so if I want to buy a new home, I want to do something, this is going to be the interest rate that I should expect going forward. We hit a rate shock, kind of like we will when the first time it gets really cold outside, right? It turns 40 degrees and we think it's just absolutely terrible until we get used to it and we have a 20-degree day, right? So the interest rate environment we have to acclimate to. I think we will have acclimated to it. The other piece that we have is that if we go down from a 7.5% mortgage rate to a 6.5% to 6.5% or 6% rate, that will help increase the affordability for some of those new homes at a $350,000, $400,000, $450,000 price point, which is where new home builders can really start to get into building some quality homes there. So those two things together are going to increase permitting activity. We just, even when I factored that in for Lawrence, it really didn't seem to make a difference there. So that's where we are. So that's our forecast. Again, you might look at just the raw numbers and you might say, well, that's not a very happy forecast, but I'm actually very optimistic about all this. The economic environment is solid. We have strong home price appreciation because of the shortage of inventory, and working through those inventory problems is just something that's going to take a long time. And so with that, I want to say a thank you once again to Security First and to Meritrust for their support of this forecast. And I want to answer any questions that you have. Yeah.
Some of what I've been reading recently talks about high pressure equilibrium where the Fed can't get inflation under control, but we still have positive growth and we still have the lowest employment. So in the short term, do you see short-term interest rates going much higher?
So the question was about whether or not we're in some sort of compression equilibrium where, let me get my slides here so I can just quickly jump back to the slides that we had about interest rates and expected inflation. That the Fed can't get interest rates, that the Fed can't get inflation under control, and yet we have this really strong economy. And it's this view that somehow we have to sort of send the economy into the tank in order to be able to get interest rates under control. And I think I lean a little less towards that view. And here's the reason why. So what caused inflation to increase when it did? Well, it was two factors that came together with it. Initially, the increase in inflation were driven by supply side effects. So we had, with the pandemic shutdowns, we had all these supply chain issues that came up. You couldn't get parts, you couldn't get the things you needed. And it caused a dramatic increase in the prices of a lot of goods and services. You also saw, about the same time, the war in the Ukraine, which sounds, how did the war in the Ukraine affect inflation? The war in the Ukraine affected inflation by affecting commodity prices, both energy prices, because Russia is a big oil and gas producer, and grain prices, because the Ukraine is kind of the breadbasket of Europe, okay? And those are worldwide markets, and so those affected things. And we saw that impact, and the reason a lot of people said, oh, this inflation is transitory, is because of, we saw that those are supply side things which the Fed can't fix. The Fed can't stop the war in the Ukraine. The Federal Reserve cannot fix supply chain problems. Those things you just have to wait out and let them resolve themselves. And the other reason we said that this is not policy related really was that it was basically worldwide. Everybody saw the price increases and the inflation that we were seeing. It wasn't a unique United States phenomenon. But then there was a second piece, and I think a lot of us, myself included, underestimated how much it would have an impact, which was the amazing stimulus that the federal government put into the economy. And this was a fiscal side, it wasn't the Fed, well, no, the Fed did their part too. The federal government gave us all these stimulus checks and everything, and then the Inflation Reduction Act. I've never heard of a law that was more misnamed than the Inflation Reduction Act. Again, it was about industrial policy. It was about trying to do things to stimulate underlying economic demand. And that, will create some positive inflationary pressures going forward. That's something that when the Fed tries to put the brakes on the economy, it will impact, those two are working against each other. But the other was the Fed's activities in lowering interest rates tremendously and the way they tripled down on buying mortgage-backed securities. I think it was $2.75 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities. That's why mortgage rates went down to the level that they did. So they really juiced up demand in the housing market, which is what led to the rapid home price appreciation. Again, I'm actually, if I were still there, this is the argument that I would be making when we're sitting around advising the president before the president goes, the bank president goes to vote on the Federal Open Market Committee. I would argue a couple things. Number one is we need to wait and see, because a lot of the increase of interest rates, at least on the real estate side of things, there are so many things that were already built into the pipeline that you couldn't stop, especially when it comes to things like construction activity. Hey, we were building this new warehouse, or we were building this apartment complex, or we were building this, we were building that. The timeline to get that done can be 1.5 or 2 years. And so once you break ground, once you get going, you can't really stop, even though the interest rates have moved against you on that. New deals you may be putting on hold, but you can't put the old one on hold. So you don't see the impact in, say, construction employment yet until a year or two down the line. It takes a long time for some of those policy steps that the Federal Reserve takes to really be felt in the real economy, okay? So we need to pause and put on hold. The second thing that I would look at here is, yes, we've brought inflation down. We're now down to a place where headline inflation and, I don't show it here, but core inflation, which is more what they're focused on, less food and energy, we're now down in the 3.5% range with that. Is that where the Federal Reserve wants it? No, they'd like it to be down lower. I think the debate that's going on internally for them is, do we need to push hard now to get it down to 2%? Or can we try and get it down to 2% slowly over the next several years? Okay? I would lean more towards let's wait and see what everything we've done so far. And so I would say no more increases. I don't think we need to decrease quite yet, but let's just wait and see, because you don't want to overcorrect, right? You're driving down the road and you start to veer off the side, you're sitting there texting and you weren't paying attention. You start to go in the other lane, and so what do? You overcorrect and you go off the side of the road. We don't want to do that, right? We want to just do minor corrections, and it takes time to see how that works out. Did that answer your question well?
Yeah.
My students sometimes accuse me of over-answering questions. So, yes, over here.
So, one of the things we've been discussing in our region has been a substantial economic driver that's going to be coming into the area. And you didn't address that at all, the Panasonic plant and what its effect may have on housing availability and housing affordability.
Right. So the question is about how did I incorporate the Panasonic plant and how that's going to affect housing availability and housing affordability. And the short, simple answer within the forecast is I didn't, okay? How would you incorporate, how would you put something like that into a model like this? It's a one-of-a-kind event that you just can't, there's no way you can go look at past history and data to do that. That being said, there have been a study by some researchers out of North Carolina that I saw last spring looking at these mega economic development things and the impact on housing markets. And they had data for all of them across the country. So instead of looking at a single event, which can be a little bit misleading and tying, they're trying to ask about everything. And the short conclusion that they were drawing with this is that the mega events only really had housing market implications when they were especially large for a very small market area. And the impacts that they had were very, very local, okay? The question of how that, for larger metropolitan areas, they just had no discernible impact whatsoever. Even when you had, a 5,000 job increase and things, it just, if you do that in Atlanta, it's not a blip on the radar screen, okay? The question is, DeSoto is a very strange combination of those two. It is a very small community next to a small metropolitan area in Lawrence, a part of a larger metropolitan area in Kansas City, but really in the exurbs of Kansas City, right? It's not a suburb of Kansas City, it's exurbs. So how will that impact? I think the real key with this is to remember that, how many jobs is it? 5,000, 6,000 total?
It's four for the main plant
And then the ancillary and other things, yeah. So let's call it 5,000 total jobs that it's bringing in. That's not 5,000 new households that are going to move into DeSoto, right? Most of the employment that we'll see from that is going to put competition for other employers in this larger Kansas City, Topeka, Lawrence, Northeast Kansas region. Matter of fact, I think some of the expectations are even that people will be driving over from Missouri to take jobs there and to do that. I tend to be relatively sanguine about the market's ability to respond to these types of things, to know, we already have, I think, 1 or 2 large apartment complexes that have been developed in DeSoto. Is that not correct? And so that's the market just looking and saying, hey, there's an opportunity here. Let's see if we can fill that. And that's appropriate risk. If they're right on that and everything goes well, they're gonna be able to make some money off of having that really great housing really close to the plant. If they're wrong, they're the ones that took the risk, and that's part of being a developer, right? And then given that it's going to be over this larger housing basin, I'm actually relatively sanguine that it's not going to make the supply issues better, okay? But I'm not sure that your supply issues are that much worse right now, given that that's been announced, than they would have been otherwise. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, all right, I had another question right here. Oh, DeSoto, okay. Did I see another hand coming up over there? Yes.
I'm curious if you feel like the return of student loan payments is going to make an impact in the affordability either of people currently in place in their homes or new buyers.
So the question is about whether or not the return of student loan payments is going to have an impact on either homeowners who are currently in their homes or on new buyers who are looking to buy on that. And that's a question that I would turn over to my mortgage lending friends, because they're the ones that really look at that and see it. I am trusting and hopeful that if I'm holding the loan in portfolio, that for those portfolio loans that we've been making, we've been paying attention to what student loan payments would you have and can you afford this once, if I've made the loan to you, I want to know that once those student loan payments restart, will you be able to afford the loan payment that we've had? And as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, there was some element of that that had to be built into the underwriting. Was that correct? Yes, and so the nodding of that is yes. So that was not totally out of the blue. Now that doesn't mean that it won't create real pain for households, because anytime you have a debt or an obligation that is lessened in one place, it means you go and you spend more money someplace else, right? That may mean that people will be going out to eat less often. It may mean people will be traveling less often. It may mean that they will have to cut back in some other areas, but presumably the loan was underwritten in a way that the borrower would still be able to afford it. To the extent that that impacts home buyers going forward, once again, the underwriting guidelines were already taking that into account. So the real question with that is, how well are households responding and saying, what my mortgage lender says I can afford is not what I want to afford? And I remember the first time when I bought my first house and got approved for a mortgage loan, and they told me how much I could afford, and I said, no. You may lend me that much money, but there's no way I want to be spending that much of my income on my housing. And those buyers will be affected by it, right? So there are some people who may have been able to qualify and say, oh, the loan will be approved, but I don't really have to spend all that. Well, now they have to spend it. Those are going to get pinched, but they're still within guidelines. So, yes, in the back.
That brings up a point. Is it possible that most of the activity that's cash recently has been those sorts of buyers? And the question comes to this inventory that is missing, like the amount of supply that's been reduced. Are we assuming moving forward it will continue to be reduced forever because we're not building enough houses, but that there's going to be some sort of triggering event that's going to release the supply back to normal levels? And if that actually occurred, would home prices correct back to maybe like a CPI inflated place?
So the question is it just home building that's caused our shortage in supply, or is there something else going on, and then that we'd have some change and trigger change in things, and would that then cause us to have potential home price drops when our inventory kind of, whatever this fundamental is, changes? Let me give an example of what would be something like that, which is housing turnover, right? How frequently does a typical household move and change? In the early 2000s, housing turnover was pretty rapid. People were buying and selling homes the way I change my shoes, right? So like, it's been 3 years, I probably ought to get a new pair regardless. Well, so certainly there is an element of that builds into supply. People choosing to churn in the housing market adds inventory. It also adds demand, right? But it's in different segments of the market. Typically when people are doing that, they're doing a move up is frequently, or move down, something, but they're changing from one type of house. They're not just buying their next door neighbor's house. They're buying a house that's different from what they have. I think our inventory levels we can hope for some of that to happen and for some other things to improve inventories, but our inventory levels are sufficiently tight. I just wouldn't see anything like that causing home prices to decline, okay? That would be extremely unusual. It would really have to be something like, a major economic, the University of Kansas closed down. And that then caused a whole bunch of people to move out of Lawrence or something that would really have this big impact. I don't see that happening, by the way. I would say there are a couple of things that give me hope towards being able to have new construction and to build the inventory issues more rapidly. One is the twin home market. To the extent that we really help and enable and have more twin homes being built that are designed for owner occupants, that's a way to get in at a slightly lower price point that becomes affordable to a larger segment. And again, that's long been a first-time home buyer price segment in the Lawrence market. I don't think there's been that much construction in that area in recent years. I'm getting a nod no, so that gives me some confirmation. But to the extent that we add some of that and build that back in, I think that's a way that we can make progress more rapidly in that supply issue. The other is the house flipping industry. I talked to an investor in Wichita, and this may be a totally isolated event, but he said the rise in interest rates that have happened over the past year have made it really hard for him to buy homes, renovate them, and hold them as rentals. Even with the increase in interest rates, in rent rates, his interest rate costs are so high that his margins get really thin. And so instead, what he has been doing to keep his teams busy and everything else, is he's been buying properties, renovating them, and reselling them. And one of the really nice things about that is that it's putting more homes in the market at these much more modest price ranges where the inventories are especially tight, putting them back in nicer fixed up homes for home buyers, especially first-time home buyers. To the extent that that wasn't just a pure anecdote and that it's happening more broadly, renovating old inventory has to be a part of dealing with the supply issues that we have. Because, again, a crappy home that nobody wants is not inventory. It doesn't fix our supply problem. But an old crappy home that's been fixed up so that it's something that people do want, that can be a fix to the supply problem. I'll just mention one other thing that's been started to become my pet cause recently is maybe we need to go back and in the high schools, we need to be teaching handyman skills or handywoman skills, right? How to fix your sink when you have a problem, how to change a light fixture, how to do these things. And the number of home buyers out there who are willing to look at a home that needs a little bit of TLC is really limited. And so as a result, it's not, those homes aren't real inventory. But back in the day, a lot of us bought our first houses and we knew we were going to put in sweat equity, right? And to the extent that we help young people learn that these are life skills, basic personal finance, how to work a screwdriver and do some of these things, those can benefit them long term, and those too could help some of our supply problems. So just a thought to tuck away. Other questions? Well, I want to thank you so much. I've appreciated it. I've enjoyed the time here and really love the partnership that we have. Rob and the staff over at the Lawrence Board of Realtors are fantastic to work with. And so very grateful, and you all have a wonderful day.